So again, it's just so great, Peter, to have you here at the University of Central Asia in the School of Arts and Sciences. Obviously, the conference which we are organizing together, and you as a principal investigator of the cluster, certainly has many things to do with the general topic of the cluster and with the modernity in Central Asia. The topic of the empires is, of course, one of the post-imperial arrangements of the society is, of course, one of the widely discussed now, and one of the most important topics, especially for this region, for Central Asia, which always was on the crossroads of different empires, well, Chinese, Persian, Russian, British, etc. And of course, all these things, I mean, well, one hand is one side of the story is all this empirical history, but another side is conceptualization of all these phenomena. Could you possibly talk a bit about your contribution to the conference, your talk during the conference, how it fits the general topic, or maybe some reflections about the topic as well. So, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Maxim. First of all, thank you. It's nice to be back in Berlin, and I always enjoy the intense and fruitful discussions here. Yes, I think to start with our current global situation. I mean, we tend to think that's what our global modernity is about, that we live on a planet with nation states. They are all independent nation states. They are supposedly equal to each other. And that is, in a sense, that it's the end of history. We have gotten there. But there is something deeply problematic with this, deeply flawed with this, because clearly the states we have, they're not all equal in terms of their power, their resources. They are not all homogeneous in terms of their identity and not stable in themselves. And many of them have a past either as great powers, imperial powers, and others have a past of being part of imperial settings of dominations or of federations, but included into larger polities. And that is clearly the case of Central Asia, but also of other parts of the world. I mean, there's hardly any part of the world which was not either imperially dominating or dominated in some way or other in different historical periods. But we tend to think that since the 20th century was marked by the end of empires from the First World War onwards, then decolonization after the Second World War onwards. And then we have the particular case of the Soviet Union as a federation, but with some hegemonic structures as well. So at the end of the 20th century, all this seems to end. So I think that's why we call this Post-Imperial Constellations, but not to think that this really is an end point of history, but that we have new kinds of problems. And I think we can just say that if we use the terms environment, society, identity, environment, we think of the environment, we think of environmental degradation or climate change. We know that some societies have caused this and others are suffering from it rather. So not everyone is in the same capacity to do something about it and to remedy the situation. And that has to be globally coordinated. So we cannot leave it to the individual states, some of which are responsible and some of which are suffering. Or in terms of identity, we know that, well, in European history, there was this idea that you could put people who are rather similar together to form a political order, maybe even a liberal and democratic political order. But this has never really entirely worked out, maybe in some cases better than others. But there have always been conflicts over borders. As we know, there have been problems of minorities which were oppressed. And there is this unequal power in the current context. So I think that is what we mean by these constellations which are problematic. And well, what I have been trying to do, since you asked me, is to think about this, how we should think of empire and how we should think of nations and nation states. There has been this debate recently. I mean, I think scholarship has recognized first that we have to look globally, that we cannot write national or regional histories any longer. And secondly, that if we look globally, we see that the nation state is not the solution to all problems. It creates its own problems. And so people have gone back to empire, to think about empire, where the interesting element is that empires had to live with difference and had to govern difference with the different peoples, cultures, languages, religions within them. Whereas the nation was supposed to be homogeneous, not have difference, only similarity. And since this is not as clear any longer as people thought it to be, so we have to think about what we mean by empire and by nation, and what maybe one shouldn't jump to conclusions, but we have to think about some kinds of problems maybe can be solved in terms of a national setting. Other kinds need larger cooperation and larger forms of integration, so that there may be advantages and different disadvantages of both forms, and that we have to rethink our current global problems from a regional perspective, like in Central Asia, to see what it has been the impact of the past struggle of empires over this region on the societies which exist now, and how can, from those societies in the form in which they exist now, solutions be developed.
Right. Well, in this respect, do you think that the current interest to empires is, I mean, scholarly interest and political interest to the empire is produced, among other things, by kind of a crisis of a national state, kind of a idea of post-national constellation, you know, of Habermasian type. Or on the other hand, we also have all these very important movements of decolonization, for example, and well, the very, I mean, such crises as well, Ukrainian, Russian-Ukrainian war, for example, also produced lots of you know, thoughts about colonies, empires. You know, how is Russia a new empire or something like that? So, I mean, is it just a kind of a sign, a marker of a general crisis of contemporary polity, or contemporary political form, which produces this renewed interest to what some time ago were thought as a outdated, old-fashioned, you know, kind of political formation.
Yes, I think to talk about crisis, some people talk prematurely about crisis,
yes.
But certainly we have challenges and a transformation. And Habermas, of course, he always sounds positive at the end. I mean, he, one has to say, not least against the background of German history, he was never, he was always anti-nationalistic, so to say, against the background of the atrocities of German history. So he, in a sense, was clearly, with these writings at the end of the 1990s, looking forward to something post-national, to put the national, not to abandon it, but to put it in place. And I think this is certainly a sign of a transformation, partly because of the problems with national organization, but partly simply also because of other changes, economic and cultural, global changes, which make the nation state superseded. Even large and powerful nation states are aware of the fact that there are many problems which they cannot handle. I mean, if Habermas, for instance, is certainly aware of migration into Europe, which is a legacy of the colonial past, and which is at the same time something where one cannot just close the borders and deny that the problem exists, which has been created by imperial powers from Europe. So it's certainly that on the one hand. On the other hand, maybe for also too long, and from other parts of the world, one has considered decolonization to be the solution. But it isn't either, no? Because when if one looks first at well, there have been earlier ends of empire, but I think the term decolonization really emerges only after the Second World War, first with South Asia and then in Africa. But in South Asia, we have the Indian independence, but we have the violent clashes over the partition in India. In Africa, where in a sense the empires, the British, the French, the Belgian, they recognize they cannot deny independence any longer, but they still had an impact on shaping the current African states, where I think the most clear-sighted leaders of the young African nations, they knew that state formation is not the solution, that there has to be some kind of African federation, which has never come into existence. And so we have now a situation which some people call neo-colonial, where indeed the African states are one example for most of them, where you have independence, where you have self-determination, but it doesn't mean that you control your fate, that you can really deal with the problems you encounter. And then I think this would be an interesting question, I think, for Central Asians overall, to see how one has to understand the situation here, whether it should be called decolonization. Certainly the Soviet Union was not a typical colonial power. It was anti-colonial, as you have been analyzing in many respects. But nevertheless, the end of the close relation, or the end of the Soviet Union, first of all, and the end of the close relation to Russia, creates a new situation where I think, like as scholarship on Africa has shown, that there was an awareness of the fact that the new situation has to be dealt with in cooperation and coordination within the region, but also with a request for global coordination. And I think that is probably a challenge for Central Asian states and nations to think about how one enters into this new situation, which is a transformed situation, and maybe not just as individual independent states, but through a kind of developing of a new self-understanding as a world region.
Yeah, well, in this sense, then decolonization and de-imperialization rather would not necessarily be nationalization of the so they could be other political forms of self-determination in a way, not just right to secede, but the self-determination in terms of self-ruling and self-autonomy. So they could be other creative modern ways of organizing the polity, right? Okay.
There is a problem with that, I think, as again, African history has shown, which is a general problem with such a situation, that while what we have been saying now, I think, is true and important, it's nevertheless very difficult to achieve in the situation. Because on the one hand, in decolonized, de-imperialized, newly independent states, you immediately have new formation of power structures where when the new power is the nation-state power, there are always groups who want to grab that and run away with it. On the other hand, you also have the interest of the former imperial powers to have maybe rather many states and to deal with them separately and not have an organized region which indeed may have some capacity to decide what it wants.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I mean, I think this is exactly what we keep discussing during the conference. Today we had all this discussion about Pamiri and Tajik identities. We will proceed with Soviet Union and Russian identity tomorrow. Today we also will have the two lectures, online lectures of the scholars who could not join us face to face. So, I mean, basically, I would say that, at least up to the moment, our conference is quite successful. And thank you very much again, Peter, for providing this insight.
Let me maybe just add that we had these I think, 3 presentations about Central Asia and Pamir, historically and then more from a contemporary angle. I just have to say that I really benefit a lot from these discussions, because not only do I learn a lot about this region, but also one can get an understanding of the different regional situations and how they all have an impact, not only for their own region, but for how we can think about political forms like empires, nations, and federations. One tends to think always from one's own setting, and there is, of course, a long European and Western history or way of history writing. And one sees when one situates oneself in another world region that some concepts even change, and they are not the same any longer. So I'm very grateful for this occasion, and I hope we continue along those lines.
We do. We will certainly. Thank you. Thank you.